He thought he was escaping the world for a quiet weekend at his lake cabin. Just him, the water, and the solitude he deserved. But when the door slammed open, strangers stormed inside, men who had no right to be there. They didn't know who he was, but they assumed everything. In that moment, a simple retreat turned into a nightmare, and the truth waiting behind those walls would shock him, the neighbors, and even the law itself. What would happen when the very people meant to protect the rules became the source of injustice? He had always been a man of quiet routines, a devoted son, a loyal friend, and someone who cherished the small joys in life, the soft rustle of leaves along the lake, the warmth of a morning coffee, the gentle hum of a boat cutting through water at sunrise. His life wasn't filled with fame or riches. Instead, it was measured by moments of peace, the kind that slipped by unnoticed but left a mark on the heart. Friends called him thoughtful, neighbors called him reliable, and strangers who met him often remarked on his calm, steady presence. The lake cabin was his sanctuary. Tucked away from the rush of the city, surrounded by towering pines and the reflective shimmer of water, it was a place where he could breathe freely. Each summer, he would escape here, carrying nothing more than a backpack, a few essentials, and the hope of uninterrupted solitude. No meetings, no deadlines, no expectations. Just the sound of water lapping against the dock and the occasional call of a distant loon. He wasn't looking for trouble, and trouble had never found him, at least not in this part of the world. His neighbors were friendly enough, the homeowners association HOA polite and professional, and his life, by all appearances, was as ordinary and uneventful as the calm waters surrounding his cabin. He maintained the property carefully, respecting the rules, quietly paying dues, and keeping to himself. On the surface, he fit in perfectly, but even in this quiet paradise, shadows lingered, shadows of suspicion, whispers of who he was, and assumptions no one voiced aloud. Though he had built a life of dignity and respect, he carried with him a history that others could not see, the experience of living in a world where the color of your skin could rewrite the story of who you were in a single glance. He had faced it before, of course, in subtle ways: a hesitant glance from a clerk, a double take from someone who didn't expect him there, but never like this. Not here, in his place of peace. Not when he had done nothing to provoke it. That summer had started like any other. He arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening, the sun dipping behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The air smelled of pine and water, of freedom and promise. He unpacked his few belongings, set down his bag, and let himself sink into the quiet he so desperately sought. That night, he cooked a simple dinner, ate in silence, and watched as the stars emerged, one by one, above the lake. It was perfect, until it wasn't, because in the shadows of this idyllic retreat, there were eyes watching him. He didn't know it yet, but some of the people who came to enforce rules and maintain appearances had already decided they didn't like what they saw. They didn't know his story, his rights, or the life he had built. All they knew was what they assumed, and assumptions in this world can be deadly. The peace he had nurtured so carefully, the sanctuary he thought was untouchable, was about to be shattered. And then, there was the meeting. He had invited someone important that weekend, someone whose presence could change the trajectory of his life. The state attorney general was due to arrive, a figure who carried authority, influence, and a promise of justice. It was meant to be a quiet consultation about a matter he had been pursuing for years, something deeply personal, something tied to fairness, equality, and accountability. He didn't know the visit would coincide with chaos. He didn't know that the very people entrusted to uphold order in the neighborhood would become the storm breaking through his door. As the sun rose the next morning, painting golden light across the lake, there was no hint of the conflict about to erupt. The birds sang, the water sparkled, and he prepared for a day that should have been ordinary. Every step felt familiar: making coffee, checking his emails, organizing paperwork. Yet beneath the rhythm of routine, a tension hummed in the air, subtle but undeniable, a prelude to something that would change everything. Something that would turn this quiet man's life into a story of injustice, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. He didn't know it yet, But his world was about to collide with assumptions, prejudice, and authority in a way that would leave no part of him untouched. The lake cabin, his sanctuary, would become the stage for a confrontation. He never asked for a confrontation that would reveal more about society's blind spots than he ever imagined. And in the eye of that storm, the question would emerge: when the people sworn to protect the rules become the source of injustice, who can you turn to? The morning started like any other. Sunlight spilled across the cabin floor, glinting off the polished wood surfaces and illuminating the papers spread neatly across the table. He was methodical, preparing for the meeting with the state attorney general. This wasn't just a casual visit, it was a chance to hold systems accountable, to seek answers, to shine a light on issues he had faced quietly for years. He felt calm, focused, confident even, believing the walls of his sanctuary were impermeable. But the calm shattered in an instant. Heavy footsteps echoed across the porch, harsh and uninvited, followed by the abrupt slam of the cabin door. His heart jumped. He knew no one else was supposed to arrive this early. The intruders didn't knock, didn't announce themselves. Men in crisp uniforms, badges glinting in the morning sun, barged in, their eyes scanning the room with suspicion and barely concealed disdain. They were from the HOA, claiming violations, rules, and regulations, but the words sounded hollow, rehearsed, and pointed. They didn't care about the meticulous maintenance of the property, the dues paid on time, the countless efforts he had made to comply with every rule. To them, he was already guilty. The air thickened, oppressive with judgment, as if the walls themselves held their assumptions. He tried to explain, to reason, but the words fell on deaf ears. Every protest, every logical argument was met with incredulity, as though his very presence was an inconvenience. Their tone, their posture, their eyes all screamed a silent accusation: "You don't belong here." He could feel the injustice pressing in, tangible, suffocating. And yet, he remained composed, steady, refusing to let anger dictate his response. Inside, however, a storm raged. The intruders began rifling through the cabin, treating personal spaces like evidence in a crime he hadn't committed. Files were flipped open, chairs moved aside, and every gesture was an assertion of power. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but he knew that losing control would give them exactly what they wanted. The tension coiled tighter around him, every heartbeat echoing louder in his ears. Then, the sound of another car approaching made his pulse spike. He glanced out the window and saw it, the sleek black vehicle carrying the state attorney general. The timing, perfect yet perilous, made his stomach twist. If only they had known who he was hosting, perhaps the intrusion would have stopped. But assumptions don't pause for facts. In that moment, the injustice of it all crystallized. The very people who were supposed to maintain order were trampling it. Inside, the HOA representatives grew bolder, ignoring his protests entirely. He watched as they made disparaging remarks under their breath, sneering at the decor, at the space, at him. Every glance was loaded with judgment, every gesture a silent condemnation. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was about control, about reminding him of a place they believed he didn't deserve. The fear of escalation clawed at his chest, but so did something sharper: righteous anger. He refused to cower. Time stretched thin as the minutes crawled by. The air vibrated with tension, an invisible line drawn between him and the intruders. He tried to buy time, subtly maneuvering toward his phone, dialing contacts, trying to summon help without provoking violence. Every second felt like an eternity. Outside, the lake shimmered innocently, unaware of the turmoil inside. Then, the door swung open again, this time with authority and purpose. The state attorney general stepped in, calm but alert, and immediately sensed the chaos. The intruders froze, caught between official authority and their own misplaced sense of superiority. For a fleeting second, power shifted, the room holding its breath. But he knew this confrontation wasn't over. The battle for respect, for justice, for acknowledgement, had only just begun. And just as he thought he could finally explain, one of the HOA men sneered, dismissing the AG with a wave of his hand, making it clear they believed no law or official could interfere with what they considered their territory. That single gesture, That single act of defiance ignited a mix of fear and fury within him. This was no longer about rules, it was about prejudice, assumption, and power unchecked. He felt cornered, yet resolute. Every fiber of his being screamed that he would not let this injustice go unchallenged, not in his sanctuary, not in his life. And as the HOA representatives exchanged smug glances, certain they had won, he realized something crucial. The story wasn't theirs to control. The truth, the law, and the persistence of those who recognized fairness were about to expose every misstep, every assumption, every act of bias they had inflicted. But before that resolution could unfold, the tension reached its peak. One HOA member, growing increasingly reckless, stepped closer, his voice sharp, his intentions unmistakable. The room felt impossibly small, the air heavy, the moment suspended between danger and revelation. Would this confrontation escalate into something irreversible? Or would the arrival of authority finally tip the scales toward justice? The answer hung, tantalizingly, just out of reach, leaving a cliffhanger that demanded to be unraveled. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Every movement, every sound, carried weight. The HOA representatives had grown bolder, their smirks widening as though daring him to challenge them. Their intrusion was no longer about rules. It was about dominance, an assertion of power over someone they deemed out of place. He could feel their assumptions pressing against him, a physical force that made his chest tighten and his pulse hammer in his ears. He stood his ground, but even in that moment of defiance, a knot of fear twisted in his stomach. The intruders' glances were sharp, calculating, and one misstep could escalate everything into a confrontation with consequences far beyond mere arguments. Their eyes, cold and unyielding, held the kind of disdain reserved for those they considered inferior. And yet, beneath that fear, anger surged, a white-hot fire fueled by years of subtle prejudice, whispered assumptions, and moments where society had quietly dictated that he was less than he deserved. The state attorney general, calm but firm, finally stepped fully into the room, placing a steadying presence between him and the intruders. Authority clashed with arrogance in a silent, tense standoff. For a brief moment, it seemed the confrontation might de-escalate, but the HOA men were not ready to yield. They had spent years policing a neighborhood not for fairness but for appearances, and the idea that someone they judged could stand alongside the law challenged everything they believed about control. One of them, taller, heavier, a man who carried himself like the rules were his personal weapon, took a step closer, his voice low, almost a growl. "You don't belong here," he said, each word dripping with assumed superiority. It wasn't a complaint about property lines or paperwork. It was a verdict, delivered with the certainty that the world agreed with him. The words landed like stones, heavy and cold, yet they did not crush him. Instead, they ignited something sharper, more precise. Resolve. He remembered every time society had whispered its biases, every glance that assumed guilt where there was none, every subtle act meant to remind him of his place. They were counting on that fear, on that hesitation, but they had misjudged him. Years of navigating a world designed to marginalize him had taught patience, strategy, and an unyielding sense of justice. And now, in his sanctuary, in front of men who thought their assumptions were law, he would not falter. The tension built to a near-palpable crescendo. Papers scattered across the table, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the gentle ripple of sunlight across the floor all became background noise to the storm of human emotion in the room. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The intruders' movements grew erratic. They sensed a shift, the slow erosion of the power they thought they wielded. The state attorney general's eyes met his, offering a quiet but powerful assurance. This is not just about one person's rights, it's about truth. And then it happened. One HOA representative, losing patience, reached toward him, a gesture meant to intimidate, to assert physical dominance over a man they already deemed inferior. For a split second, the room froze. Time slowed. Fear surged like a wave, sharp and biting, but so did clarity. He did not flinch. He did not retreat. Every ounce of composure he had cultivated over a lifetime of navigating prejudice coalesced into a single, unshakable presence. The AG moved decisively, placing authority between action and threat. "Step back," they commanded, voice firm and unyielding. It was not a suggestion. It was law. The intruders hesitated, caught between the weight of official power and their own assumptions. In that brief standoff, he could feel the invisible scales of justice tilting ever so slightly. It was a moment charged with raw emotion, the collision of fear and courage, power and injustice, assumptions and undeniable truth. The words that followed were sharper than any physical confrontation. The HOA men attempted to justify themselves, spouting regulations and concerns that had always existed as instruments of control rather than law. Every statement revealed more than they intended: their biases, their assumptions, their unwillingness to see a human being as anything other than what they presumed. He could feel the injustice pressing against him, but instead of retreating, he let it fuel him. Each sentence they spoke, each accusation, only made his resolve stronger. Minutes stretched like hours. Every second of the standoff was a battle, not fought with fists, but with dignity, courage, and the undeniable weight of truth. He realized in that moment that the confrontation was bigger than him. It was a mirror held up to every subtle act of prejudice, every assumption, every person made to feel less than they are because of the color of their skin. And he would not let them write that story. Finally, one by one, the HOA representatives faltered. Their confidence cracked under the weight of authority and truth. What they had assumed as control unraveled before them. His anger, his fear, and his determination converged into a single realization. Justice was not a distant promise. It could be claimed in moments of courage, even when the world insisted you step back. And as the room quieted, as the sunlight touched the scattered papers and the lake shimmered outside the window, he understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had faced the worst of assumptions, the raw edge of prejudice, and yet he had not broken. He had confronted injustice not with violence, but with presence, clarity, and unwavering dignity. But even as relief began to settle, a thought struck him like a thunderclap. This was not the end. The HOA may have retreated for now, but the story, the one that exposed bias, assumption, and the fragility of power built on prejudice, was only beginning to unfold. What came next, he knew, would echo far beyond the walls of this cabin, far beyond a single confrontation. And as he looked toward the lake, the question lingered in the air, impossible to ignore. How many more would have to face this before the world truly changed? The room finally began to settle. The HOA representatives, their confidence dismantled, retreated with muttered complaints and hesitant glances, leaving behind the echo of their assumptions. The tension that had weighed so heavily on the cabin lifted slightly, though its residue lingered in every corner. He stood in the quiet, chest still racing, mind replaying the confrontation again and again. Relief and exhaustion mingled, but beneath both ran a deeper current, the realization that he had endured something no one should have to face, and yet had emerged unbroken. He looked around at his sanctuary, the familiar walls now bearing witness to an ordeal that had turned peaceful routine into a crucible of injustice. The cabin had been a place of solitude, a retreat from the world's chaos, and now it had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the stark reality that even in spaces we consider safe, the shadows of prejudice can intrude. Each ray of sunlight that streamed through the window, each ripple on the lake outside, seemed to shine with a new meaning. Freedom is precious, fragile, and sometimes contested. The presence of the state attorney general had made a difference, not just as an authority figure, but as a reminder that the law can serve as a shield when wielded with fairness and courage. With their support, the confrontation ended without physical violence, but the emotional scars, the questions, and the awareness of systemic bias remained. He understood that this incident wasn't isolated. It wasn't a strange one-off encounter. It was part of a larger pattern, a reflection of society's persistent tendencies to judge, assume, and enforce power unevenly based on skin color. In the aftermath, he took time to process what had happened. Each reflection brought clarity. he realized that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. That calm, steady presence he had maintained wasn't just survival, it was a declaration. A declaration that no amount of prejudice, no casual dismissal of rights, and no assumption of guilt could define him. He had stood not only for himself but for anyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. But even with personal victory, he couldn't ignore the larger implications. This confrontation was a microcosm of a much broader issue: the subtle and overt ways racial bias infiltrates spaces we consider neutral or safe. Neighborhoods, workplaces, even institutions meant to uphold fairness, each can harbor assumptions and unchecked authority. The incident illuminated how easily power can be wielded to intimidate, how quickly prejudice can masquerade as protocol, and how critical it is to recognize and challenge these behaviors when they surface. He thought about the countless others who had faced similar intrusions, not necessarily in a cabin by a lake, but in homes, offices, and public spaces across the country. People whose stories often went unheard, whose dignity was questioned, and whose lives were altered in ways the world rarely acknowledged. He realized that what had happened to him was both deeply personal and universally significant. The story of bias and resistance wasn't his alone, it belonged to anyone who had ever been subjected to the quiet, persistent erosion of respect. The incident left a lasting mark on him, reshaping his understanding of safety, trust, and the importance of speaking truth to power. He became more vigilant, not out of paranoia, but out of a desire to protect himself and others from similar encounters. He documented every detail, every interaction, knowing that the story itself could serve as a tool for awareness, reflection, and change. What had once been a simple weekend retreat was now a testament to resilience, a story to be shared and remembered, a cautionary tale for those who underestimate the persistence of injustice. Yet, beyond personal vigilance, there was a deeper, more transformative realization: change doesn't rely solely on individual action. Systems, communities, and institutions must be held accountable. Bias, when left unchecked, becomes normalized. Authority, when untempered by fairness, becomes weaponized. And silence, when accepted as the path of least resistance, allows injustice to thrive. The incident at the lake cabin was a microcosm, but its lessons were universal. Awareness, courage, and action are the only antidotes to the insidious persistence of prejudice. As he reflected, a quiet resolve took hold. This was not a story to end with fear or resentment, it was a story to inspire action, empathy, and accountability. He shared his experience with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, not to dwell on the wrongs inflicted, but to illuminate the truths so many overlooked. Each retelling became a call to awareness, to question assumptions, to recognize bias, and to intervene when justice is at stake. His story became a mirror, showing the world the subtle ways prejudice operates and the power of standing firm against it. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a symbol of something larger. It represented resilience, the courage to confront injustice, and the imperative to act when faced with wrongdoing. It was a reminder that even in isolation, even in spaces presumed safe, vigilance, courage, and dignity matter. That lesson, he knew, extended far beyond the walls of the cabin, echoing across neighborhoods, workplaces, and communities. And as the lake reflected the sunset, calm once more but layered with meaning, he posed a question that would linger long after the story ended. How many times do we allow assumptions, prejudice, and unchecked authority to define who belongs and who does not? How many voices go unheard because others fear speaking up? The answers are uncomfortable, even frightening, but necessary. Because change begins not in silence, but in courage. And if we fail to confront injustice when we see it, who will? The story of that weekend would be remembered not just for the confrontation, but for the lessons it revealed: that dignity cannot be assumed, that courage is often quiet, and that the fight against prejudice is ongoing, relentless, and worth every ounce of effort. And as he closed the cabin door behind him, leaving the intruders behind, one thought echoed in his mind, clear and unshakable: justice is not given, it is claimed, defended, and most importantly, shared.